Good afternoon, students. Today is Friday, 1 October 2021. This lecture will be for yesterday's class, the 30th of September. I'm running a day late this week. I'm expecting next week to get back on track on a regular schedule. I plan to record and post your Tuesday video on Monday, and then on Tuesday I will come to class to hold a discussion session. On Wednesday, I will record your video and post it for Thursday's class. And so on Thursday, when I come to class, we will have another discussion. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I'll be doing something for your class. If you want to stay home and watch my videos, you're welcome to do so. I've enjoyed the discussions that we've had so far. Only a few students have showed up, but I found the discussions interesting and rewarding, and you may too. So feel free to come to class at 9:30 on Tuesday and Thursday and see what's going on. The discussion questions will be posted at least a day before we meet. So for Tuesday, the discussion questions will be posted by Monday, and for Thursday's discussion, the discussion questions should be posted by Wednesday. Okay, other things, I have posted 3 items so far for the second part of the course. I have posted an optional reading, which is a short biography of Richard Swinburne, the author of the book we're about to start. I also posted my lecture notes for chapter 1 of the book, and I will continue posting my lecture notes for the whole book, but I'm revising them as we go. So I can't post the whole book's lecture notes all at once. I'm going to revise the chapters as I go along, and I'll make sure that I post the appropriate chapters lecture notes before, so that you can read them and follow along when you watch my video. The third thing I posted is what I call notes and statistics on the first examination, and that summarizes some of the statistical information that I gleaned from your first exam. Now let me make a few comments about the first exam. I'm looking at that document now, which is posted on Canvas. The average score on the exam was 74.3. But actually, I pay more attention to the median score than I pay to the average or mean score. And the reason is, in a small group like this, where there are only 20 values, 20 numerical values, 20 students, a single very low score would have the effect of dragging the average down. But it wouldn't affect the median score at all. The median score is the score in the middle. That means there are as many scores above it as below it. So I tend to focus on the median. And the median on the first exam was pretty high. It was 79, almost in the B range. So I felt no need to add any points to anyone's score. I'm going to leave it as it is. And I mention that because in the past, if the median score has been lower than I think it should be, I may add 3 or 4 or 5 points to each student's score to bring the median up to what I consider a normal level. It may be on the second or third exam I end up doing that, but I'm not doing it on the first exam. Another thing that you should keep in mind is that on the first exam, I in effect gave you 20 free points, 20 out of 100. And that's because I gave you what I called a sampling of examination questions. It contained 5 true-false questions and 5 multiple-choice questions, and all 10 of them ended up on the exam. And I told you in advance that that might happen. So if you didn't take advantage of that, you have only yourself to blame. Now, there won't be sample questions for either of the other 2 exams. So you would expect that the average score would be lower on the other exams than it was on the first exam. It's not that I'm trying to make it lower. Please don't think I am. The exam will be of about the same difficulty as the other one that you took. But you won't have free points this time. So study harder than you did, work harder, and even if you don't have free points, you may be able to get the same score or even better. Now, I was a little bit disturbed by one feature of the breakdown of scores. If you look at page 1 of my notes and statistics, you'll see that the breakdown by percentile went like this. 4 students had a score somewhere in the 90s. 6 students had a score somewhere in the 80s. 3 in the 70s. 2 in the 60s. And 5 of the 20 students had a score below 60. Now, if you're one of those students, you need to recalibrate. You need to ask yourself, what is going wrong? The highest score in the exam was 97. 2 people got a score of 97, which is terrific. One person had a score of 94 and another had a score of 91. That tells me that someone who studied hard, did all the appropriate work, was able to do very well. So I don't understand actually why somebody would get a score below 60. Maybe if you're in that category, maybe you blew the course off. Maybe you did none of the reading or very little of it. Maybe the things you did read, you didn't read more than once. Maybe you read them in a casual way. You may not have listened to my online lectures, or if you did, maybe you were distracted and didn't get much out of them. Maybe you didn't look at my handouts that I've posted or my lecture notes. I don't know. Honestly, I'm giving you everything you need to do well. In fact, very well in the course. If you don't take advantage of it, I don't honestly know what to say to you. So if you got a score below 60, you have a lot of work to do to get a respectable grade in this course. It may still be possible for you to get a C in the course. Maybe not. You may have done so poorly that even if you got 100 on the second and third exams, you still can't get a C. So look at things carefully, look at your score, try to figure out what you would need to get in order to get a decent grade. The drop date for the course is about halfway through. We're not there yet. I'm not at all encouraging anyone to drop. I'm just making you aware that that's one solution to the problem of having done very poorly on the first exam. So to those of you who did well, I salute you. Keep up the good work. Maybe work even harder. If you did poorly, redouble your efforts, recalibrate, change your study habits, and work even harder than you did, and see how that works on the second exam. All right, read over the notes and statistics. I discussed some things there. For example, don't think in terms of letter grades at this point in the course. If you've got a score of 91, you shouldn't say, good, I nailed an A. And while you're in the A range right now, you're close to the B range, and you could end up with a B in the course, or even worse, a C, if you really bombed out on the second and third exams. So do not get complacent if you did well. By the same token, don't get despondent if you did poorly. It is, after all, only one of 3 exams, so you have 2/3 of the points still available to you in this course. And if you change your study habits and work even harder, you may end up with a respectable grade. Okay, there's my pep talk, if that's what you want to call it. Keep up the good work if you did well. Redouble your efforts if you didn't do so well. Okay, let's get started. Now, this is the book that's required. I've told you about it from day one. I've shown it to you. Make sure you get the revised edition. The original edition of this book came out in 1996, which is a quarter of a century ago. It was revised and republished in 2010, which is 11 years ago. The revised version contains some important changes, and the page references are going to be different. So as I go along in my lectures, if I direct your attention to page 12, that may be the correct page for this edition, but if you're looking at the original edition, you might not be able to find it or find it right away. You may have to look at several pages. Maybe it's on page 10 or 14 of the original edition. So it's going to be very confusing if you try to use the original edition. Get the revised edition. It's a cheap paperback. You shouldn't have to pay more than, $10 or $15 for it. Maybe less if you can find a used version. And remember, even used versions, while they may have markings in highlighting inside, it still should be readable to you. So if your goal is to save money, you should be able to do that on this book. If you want a nice, clean, brand new version, you can find that online as well, either by going to the Oxford University Press website or perhaps Amazon.com or some other online bookseller. All right, I brought in my copy since I'm going to mention it in a few minutes. Here's another book that Swinburne published. This was published in 2008, shortly before he revised this book. And this is a companion. This is a companion to this, Swinburne says. And I'll say more about this in a moment. I happen to have the hardcover version here, but I think it was published in paperback as well. So you can acquire this if you want and read it on your own. I will not be discussing it. I simply brought it in to show you that Swinburne has a companion volume to the book that we're discussing. So let's get started. I'll put my notes up here. Sometimes they fall down with a bang, but I'll try to keep that from happening. Now, I want to cover today, if possible, the introduction to the revised version, which is 3 pages long, and chapter 1, which is 14 pages in length. Now, ideally, I would cover all 17 pages, but I don't want to go over the limit. I don't want to go more than an hour and 15 minutes. So we'll see how it goes. This happens to be a long chapter with a lot packed into it. So even if we don't finish it today, even if I cut it off short, I will spend the first part of our next lecture going back over it, or covering the parts that we didn't cover before getting into chapter 2. So one way or another, either today or Tuesday, we'll get through chapter 2. By the way, I noticed this morning my voice is a little bit raspy. I feel like I have some kind of a sore throat. It may simply be allergies. I know ragweed is probably high at this time of year, and I am allergic to ragweed, so probably it'll be a one-day thing. So far, my voice seems fine. But if things deteriorate over the next few days, we do have a fallback option. And I hope we don't have to do this, but we could. If my voice is gone on Tuesday or if I'm sick, I shouldn't come to class so that other people catch whatever I have. So if all goes poorly and I don't want to come to class, I'll simply post my 2 lectures on Monday and Wednesday. And that's assuming my voice holds out enough to lecture online. So I have 2 reasons that I may not go to class next week. One, so I don't infect anybody with something I may have. And secondly, my voice may not be strong enough to speak. Of course, if that's the case, then maybe my voice won't be strong enough to record a video either. So I'm just warning you. I'll let you know. Let's assume that everything will be fine, and it probably will be. But you never know how things go. This could be the first day of several days of a sore throat or a bronchial infection. I could get laryngitis, which has happened before. Many years ago, I lost my voice entirely. I even went to the class and I wrote on the board, I have laryngitis. I can't speak. I'll see you Thursday. It's funny in retrospect. It wasn't funny at the time because I want to do my job, and my job is to be in class lecturing. So we'll see how it goes. Enough about that. Let's get to Swinburne's introduction. Notice this is the introduction to the revised edition of his book. He didn't include the original introduction. So let's begin with some general points, some introductory points. Swinburne says early on in his introduction, and I'll quote him here from page 1, Swinburne says, for the last 30 or 40 years, and that would mean about 1970 to 1980. So since the 70s or 80s, there has been a revival of serious debate among philosophers of the English-speaking world about the existence of God. And I can point out to you that Swinburne has been an active participant in that debate. It's really an exciting time to be working in philosophy of religion. Now, some philosophers look down their noses on it. They think it's not a high-powered, rigorous, serious branch of philosophy. I don't agree with that. I think it's an important branch of philosophy. It was discussed by philosophers going back to the ancient world. Many of the arguments for and against the existence of God are many, many centuries old, and they continue to be relevant today. They continue to be discussed and debated today. And things really picked up, according to Swinburne, about 30 or 40 years ago. And it's going like what's the expression? Barn busters or barn burners? Maybe it's neither of those, but it's going strong right now. And I assume it will continue to do so. The aim of Swinburne's book, he tells us on page 1, is to put forward for a wider public a short version of the positive case for the existence of God. Now, Swinburne has published many books over the years on not only religious topics, but also on the philosophy of science and logic, and the philosophy of mind, metaphysics. He's a well-traveled philosopher. One of his books, published, I believe, originally in 1979, was entitled The Existence of God. And in that book, he made a book-length argument in favor of theism, in favor of the truth of theism. He argued that there is a God. Now, that book is long and difficult. So at some point, Swinburne decided that he would write a shorter, simpler version of his argument for not just his fellow philosophers, but for any intelligent person to read and to think about, and perhaps to be persuaded by. So this book is designed for people like you, people who are not or not yet credentialed philosophers, people who are intelligent and inquisitive and curious, and who like to think about difficult things like the existence of God. Swinburne goes on to talk about science a little bit, and you'll see that that's an important topic in this book. Swinburne says that science continues advancing. Science is always in the process of development. Theories in physics and biology and other branches of science continue to be refined, and sometimes revolutions occur in science. Swinburne says that these discoveries, specifically in biology and cosmology, which is a branch of physics that concerns the origin and structure of the universe. That's what cosmology is. These discoveries, Swinburne says, leave open the question whether there is a God who caused and sustains the existence and operation of our universe and any other universes there may be, or whether the existence and operation of the universe has no more ultimate explanation. In other words, this is me talking now, in other words, science isn't dispositive on the question of the existence or nature of God. So there are foolish people who think that science can tell us whether there is a God, and if so, what kind of being God is. Swinburne says that's not the case. It's not a scientific matter whether there is a God. That's not something scientists as such are competent or equipped to answer. That's not within their bailiwick. That's not within the province of science. So Swinburne says, however advanced biology and cosmology have become, it's still an open question whether there's a God. And so there's a need for philosophers. We can't leave this important question to scientists. There's a need for philosophers like Swinburne and Mackey and Rowe to make arguments that are designed to persuade people that there is or is not a God. So what is the basic structure of Swinburne's argument? I'm going to read a fairly long quotation from pages 1 and 2. And I'm going to read it because it gives you in advance an idea of what the rest of the book is about. You'll notice that Swinburne is going to use the scientific method to prove the existence of God. It's an ingenious approach. That doesn't mean that he succeeds or that everyone thinks he succeeds, but it's an approach that is at least promising and at least interesting. So here's what he writes. The basic structure of my argument is this. Scientists, historians, and detectives observe data and proceed thence to some theory about what best explains the occurrence of these data. We can analyze the criteria which they use in reaching a conclusion that a certain theory is better supported by the data than a different theory. That is more likely on the basis of those data to be true. Using those same criteria, we find that the view that there is a God explains everything we observe, not just some narrow range of data. Now, that word everything is in italics in my notes, and I tell you at the end of the quotation that those italics are in the original. They're in the book. I didn't add them. Sometimes I add italics because I want to emphasize something that someone said. But this time, Swinburne emphasized the word everything. He means everything can be explained by the existence of God. Not just biological phenomena, not just natural phenomena of the sort that physicists study or chemists, everything. Why there's a world at all, why it has in it the things that it has in it, why there are human beings with the characteristics that they have, everything except the existence of God itself is explainable or explicable in terms of God. Now that's a powerful claim. Here's how he summarizes what he just said. I put the words "in short" in brackets. Those are my words. In short, the very same criteria which scientists use to reach their own theories leads us to move beyond those theories to a creator God who sustains everything in existence, unquote. Now, is that not bold and brazen even? Swinburne, who is a longtime student of science, a philosopher of science, Swinburne says, let's use the scientific method to formulate a theory that explains not only everything biologists explain, and physicists, and chemists, and geologists, but everything, literally everything about the world can be explained by this theory, which he calls theism. So whether you think that he succeeds in this attempt or not, you've got to admit it's a bold, provocative strategy. Now, before moving on to the first chapter, Swinburne takes up a couple of objections that are raised to his project, and he replies to those objections. He says, some modern theologians have objected that the concept of God, which I develop in chapter 1, that's the concept we're about to discuss, is not the Christian concept of God, or perhaps even the Jewish or Islamic one. And so they claim that my arguments have no relevance to their religions. Now think about that for a moment. According to Swinburne, certain of his critics, he calls them theologians, say that even if Swinburne's argument succeeds, he's not even talking about the sort of God they believe in, the sort of God they discuss in their theological work. There are two forms of the objection, according to Swinburne. He's going to state each objection and reply to it. So here's the first one. And I'm reading from my notes. Again, I posted my notes. You should print them and follow along as I go. This is page 2 of my notes near the top. Okay, some of this is me talking. I'll tell you when I'm quoting from Swinburne. Okay, the first objection goes like this. The God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which, by the way, are the three so-called Abrahamic religions. The God of those religions is, quote, totally incomprehensible, unquote. That's according to the theologians. Another word for incomprehensible is inscrutable. And that's related to the word scrutinize. When you scrutinize something, you look closely and carefully at it. Scrutiny. So God, according to these theologians, is inscrutable or incomprehensible. And not just partly incomprehensible. According to Swinburne, they say that God is totally incomprehensible. That's a very strong claim. Swinburne's arguments claim to show that God is, quote, all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly free, unquote. And when Swinburne claims that God has those properties or characteristics, Swinburne is implying that God is comprehensible to at least some degree. Swinburne is claiming or implying in this book that God is not totally incomprehensible. So Swinburne needs to reply to this objection. And here's what he says. Swinburne says, while some of the words that are used to describe God are, quote, stretched or analogical, some are not. Not all the words that we use to describe God are being used in a metaphorical sense or an analogical sense. Some of them are used in a literal, strict sense. And Swinburne thinks this is appropriate. Swinburne says that according to certain Christian creeds and doctrines, God is described, quote, as having the properties that he ascribes to God. So Swinburne says to these theologians, wait a minute now, I didn't just make this stuff up. I read the Christian creeds and doctrines, the scriptures, and I find in those documents support for my view that God is not totally incomprehensible. In other words, Swinburne says, I find support for the view that God is to at least some degree comprehensible, scrutable. Swinburne also says that, and I'm quoting now from page 3, in the Christian tradition, God is not supposed to be totally incomprehensible. So Swinburne thinks he's got scripture on his side and that the theologians are wrong. Anybody who claims that God, the Christian God at any rate, is totally incomprehensible is simply mistaken. Swinburne thinks that there's adequate support for the contrary view. So that's the first objection, and that's Swinburne's reply to it. He's trying to put those theologians in their place in a kind way, a civil way. Here's the second objection. The Christian God, according to the critics, is three persons in one substance. That's a quotation from Swinburne. Swinburne's arguments do not show the existence of that God, according to the critics. By the way, there's an unfortunate typo. My version of the book has the word now on page 3. It's obviously the word not. Somebody let that slip through. So, according to the critic, Swinburne's arguments have done nothing to show that the triune God exists. Triune, Triune, the God that Christians worship, the God that is three persons in one substance. Those three persons, as most of you probably know, are the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Those three distinct persons somehow are combined in one Godhead, in one person. That is called the doctrine of the Trinity. And most of you probably are aware of that. Some of you may not be. Now, Swinburne has to reply to this objection. He says, first of all, that he, in this book, is not concerned with the distinctively Christian God, the God that is said to be three persons in one. Swinburne, in this book that we're discussing, is concerned with a more generic God, the God of not just Christianity, but Judaism and Islam, the Abrahamic God, the monotheistic God. So Swinburne, in this book that we're discussing, isn't concerned specifically with the Christian God. It's this book, the companion volume, in which Swinburne discusses various characteristics of the Christian God. And his answer to the question is, was Jesus God? Is yes. And not all of those Abrahamic religions agree with that. Christians do. They believe that Jesus was God, literally. So Swinburne's reply to the objection, the second objection, is, I agree that I'm not arguing for the triune God in this book, but that wasn't my plan. I argue for the triune God, the Christian God, in the other book. So you should go read that book, he says to the critics. Okay? He calls that on page 3 the companion volume to this book. So they're meant to be a pair. They're meant to be read together as one book. Okay, let's finish up the introduction with one more comment. Swinburne's argument is directed not to the world at large, but to a proper subset of the world. And this type of argument is called argumentum ad hominem. And that's Latin for an argument to the person, or more precisely, an argument to a particular type of person, someone who believes certain things already, or has certain commitments. So who is the audience for Swinburne's book if it's not the whole world? His audience, it seems to me, is religious skeptics who embrace science, and specifically the scientific method. It's those people whom Swinburne thinks he can persuade. Since they embrace the scientific method, Swinburne is saying to them, look, you embrace the scientific method. Let me show you in this book that the scientific method that you accept commits you to believing in God, the monotheistic God, with all the properties that we're going to discuss in chapter 1. So in a way, Swinburne is playing the game by the skeptic's rules, and he thinks he's going to win the game. He's playing by the rules laid down by the skeptic, the rules of science, the methods of science. Swinburne is very audacious. He not only thinks that science is compatible with religion, which is a fairly mild claim, though not everyone agrees with that. Swinburne goes further. He says that the scientific method supports belief in God. Now that is quite bold and provocative, and many people reading that will have their hackles raised, and they will be eager to read what Swinburne has to say in the rest of the book. They'll probably start off thinking he's bound to fail, but maybe, just maybe, by the end of the book, they will be persuaded by Swinburne and agree with him that science supports belief in God. Far from being incompatible with it, it supports it. Okay, you ready to get started on chapter 1? Let's do so. I have 4 pages of notes, and we're almost done with the second page already. So my voice is holding up. We're only 33 minutes in. Let's proceed to chapter 1. Okay, what is theism? That's an important term in this book. Ultimately, Swinburne is going to be arguing for the truth of theism. He's going to argue that theism is best supported by the scientific method, as opposed to its various rivals. What is theism? Here's what he says on page 5. Theism is, quote, the claim that there is a God, understood in the way that Western religion, and he means by that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has generally understood that claim, unquote. In this book, Swinburne, quote, spells out what the claim amounts to, unquote, and he discusses, quote, the grounds for believing it to be true, unquote. So that's 2 things. In this book, Swinburne is going to clarify theism by specifying the properties possessed by God in great detail, and then he's going to argue that this being, this sort of God, indeed exists. He's going to provide grounds for the truth of theism. Okay? Not distinctively Christian theism, but the sort of theism that Christianity shares with Judaism and Islam. All right? Swinburne is not assuming that God exists. When Swinburne says God has the following properties, the careless reader might think that he is assuming that God exists. He's not. What Swinburne is saying is, on the assumption that God exists, God would be like this. The God of these great religions is believed to have the following properties. In fact, if Swinburne, by talking about God and using the word God, if he were assuming the existence of God, he would be committing a fallacy. That fallacy you may have heard of is called the fallacy of begging the question. That fallacy occurs when you assume the very thing you're trying to prove. That would, of course, be circular. If you're trying to prove that God exists, which he is trying to do in this book, at no point in your argument are you allowed to assume that God exists. That would be question begging. That would be bootstrapping. That would be like trying to lift yourself up from your bootstraps. Try that sometime and let me know how it works. It would be circular reasoning. So Swinburne is trying to be very clear up front. I am not, just by talking about God or using the word God, I am not assuming that God exists. He's trying to clarify the claims that are made about God by those who do believe in God. Okay, next point. You notice these are bullet points that I used in my lecture notes, things I want to discuss with you. I don't claim to discuss everything in this chapter. That would make my notes even longer and take even longer. I'm trying to extract the main points, the points that will be of use later on in the book. Swinburne says on page 5, theism claims that God is a personal being. That is, in some sense, a person. So you and I are persons. So is God, Swinburne says. That's part of theism. It's the part of theism that believes that God, or says that God, is a person like you and me. Now, God may not be like you and me in all respects, maybe only a few. But one thing God has in common with us is that God, like us, is a person, a personal being. Not all religions hold that view. We discussed earlier in the course the idea that there are atheistic religions like Jainism and Buddhism. These are religions that do not postulate or assert the existence of a personal God. So they're atheistic, non-theistic. Theistic religions like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam hold the view that there is a personal God. So they differ significantly from Jainism and Buddhism. They may all be religions, but they divide into two different types of religion. If you go back to one of my handouts from early in the course, a taxonomy of religions, you can see precisely what I'm now talking about. I'm not going to go back to the handout. You can look at it and make sense of it on your own. It should be self-explanatory. Now, what does Swinburne mean by the word person? He tells us on page 5. By a person, I mean an individual with basic powers to act intentionally, purposes, and beliefs. So a person is any being which has basic powers, purposes, and beliefs. So this object I'm holding up is an object. It's a physical object like you and me. Whatever you and I are, whatever else you and I are, we're physical objects. We exist in time and space, just like this pen. But you and I have purposes. We have powers. We have beliefs. This pen has none of those things. So you and I have something in common with this pen, namely being physical objects, but we also have an important difference. You and I are persons. This pen is not. Okay? I'm not putting the pen down. That pen may be a perfect specimen of its kind, but it is different from you and me. Not necessarily inferior, but certainly different. Let's now turn to the concept of actions. Swinburne, like many philosophers, distinguishes between what he calls basic actions and non-basic actions. Non-basic actions are actions we perform by doing other actions, including basic actions. Now, Swinburne gives the following example. He says that his going to Oxford, which is a town in England and also the home of a great university, Swinburne's going to Oxford is a non-basic action. That means he performs that action by doing certain other things, by performing certain other actions. For example, he goes to the station, the train station. He gets on the train. Swinburne performs the action of going to Oxford by performing those other basic actions. What would a basic action be? Well, it's something very simple like squeezing your hand or moving your leg. Those are also Swinburne's examples. So when you want to go get the mail, that's a non-basic action. How do you get the mail? You get the mail by performing basic actions like rising from your seat, moving your legs in order to walk, using your hand to open the door, pulling the door open, going outside, walking to the mailbox, using your legs, and getting the mail. So many of the actions we perform are non-basic. We perform them by performing typically a series of basic actions. So Swinburne's going to come back and talk about this shortly. Is God able to perform actions? And if so, what type? Can God perform basic actions, or is God limited somehow to performing non-basic actions? You'll see later that God has no body, unlike you and me. God is disembodied, a disembodied person, an incorporeal being. That's a fancy Latin term for non-embodied or disembodied. So let's turn to the top of page 3. We're moving right along. What is a basic power? That's a new term. It's got the same prefix, basic, but it's a different term. Swinburne says on page 6, by a basic power, I mean a power to perform a basic action. So you and I have basic powers because you and I have the power to perform basic actions like moving our legs. Now, these basic powers include powers of thought as well as powers over that small chunk of matter which each of us calls his or her body. Now, I love the way Swinburne puts that. Think of you and me and every other person. Each of us has control over a small chunk of matter. My body. This is my body. You can see where it starts and ends. And I, Keith, a person, have control over that little piece of matter. And I use that body to achieve my purposes, right? By going to get the mail or going to Oxford. Now, Swinburne has control over a different piece of matter. And you have control over your own piece of matter. We use this matter to perform non-basic actions, right? We move our body in various ways, grasping, moving our legs, rising, things like that. Talking, those are basic actions. We also have powers of thought. It's basic powers of thought. We have the power to reason. We have the power to make distinctions. We have the power to converse with others, to express ideas. So our powers are not limited to moving our body in various ways. They include powers of the mind, powers of thought. Okay, moving on. Swinburne wants to talk a little bit about knowledge and about what it is. He says on page 6, when beliefs are true and well justified, they constitute knowledge. Now, he's actually opened up a can of worms here. Many philosophers deny that justified true belief constitutes knowledge. They say that while justified true belief is necessary for knowing something, it's not sufficient. So we'll have to give Swinburne a little bit of leeway. He's harking back to a very old theory that comes from Plato, which is the view that knowledge is justified true belief. Let me say a few words about that. In order to know something, literally, 3 things have to be the case. First of all, you have to believe it. In order to know that the Rangers won the game last night, you have to at least believe it. So all knowledge is belief, but not all belief is knowledge. Secondly, in order to know that the Rangers won last night, it has to be true. Okay? You can't know false things. Only truths can be known. Okay? So all knowledge consists of true beliefs. Not all true beliefs amount to knowledge, though. You could have a true belief about something and not know it. Why? Because you're missing the third element, which is justification. It's not enough to believe something that happens to be true. You have to have good reasons to believe it. You have to be justified in believing it. So, according to Swinburne, let's think of knowledge as justified true belief. When all of those 3 conditions obtain, Swinburne wants to say, we will say that you know what you believe. It's not just a belief anymore, it's knowledge. Now let's move on. What are some other characteristics of God? Swinburne says on page 7 that God is neither male nor female. God is not sexed, S-E-X-E-D. God has no sex, no biological sex. Swinburne, though, refers to God with male pronouns, which is the traditional way of doing it. He, however, says, you should not assume that because I'm using male pronouns to refer to God, that I believe or am asserting that God is male. He explicitly denies that. Okay? So be careful. He disclaims any implication of maleness by using male pronouns to refer to God. Okay, there's a lot more that could be said about that. If God is not male or female, what is God? Is God a combination of male and female, perhaps? Is God neither male nor female, but some other thing? Why does Swinburne not use the word it to refer to God, or she instead of he? Or how about he or she to be neutral? But let's let him use whatever pronouns he wants. He says, I'm going to use masculine pronouns, and I mean nothing by that. I don't mean to imply that God is a male. Now, God's powers are infinite in a certain sense, in the sense that God, quote, can bring about as a basic action any event he chooses, unquote. So I'm going to use the male pronouns when I'm quoting Swinburne. So Swinburne says God can do anything as a basic action. God specifically can create, conserve, or annihilate anything, big or small. So just a few examples. God can annihilate this pen. God, through a sheer act of will, can cause this pen not to exist. Now, whether it explodes into tiny fragments or just disappears, that depends on how God wants to do it. Or maybe it'll degrade slowly over time and eventually disappear. God can bring into existence new objects, physical objects. God can create a new river running through Texas as a basic action. God can take a river that's currently flowing through river, like the Brazos, flowing through Texas, like the Brazos River, and make it go away. God can do any of those things: create, conserve, or annihilate anything in the natural or physical world, all as a basic act. The same way we perform basic acts, except that is a much vaster power than you and I have. I may be able to pick up this pen using my hand as a basic act, but God can do as a basic act things far grander than that, destroying whole planets or creating new planets and things like that. Again, in discussing these properties of God, we are not assuming that God exists. We're trying to characterize God so that when Swinburne argues for the existence of God, we know what sort of being he's arguing for. Okay, we covered that. God is not limited by laws of nature. Now, Mackey discussed this in his essay, Evil and Omnipotence. Swinburne says, the reason God cannot be limited by the laws of nature is simple. God created the laws of nature. God created the world and everything in it, including the various laws, the law of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, and all the other laws that operate, the causal or physical or natural laws that operate. All of them were created by God for a particular reason or for a particular purpose. Science is the discipline or institution of trying to figure out what those natural, physical, causal laws are. And it's amazing how much humans have figured out already. There are things that are unknown to this day, and maybe one day humans, if they apply themselves, will figure it out. So the world is becoming more and more known to us. If there's a God, God would say, that's how I planned it. I gave you reason and the senses, sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing, so that you can go out into the world, make careful observations, and using your reason that I gave you, God would say, formulate and test theories or hypotheses about the world. And that's how you come to know about your world. So, according to a theist, that's all part of God's plan, the process of science, the process of using reason and senses to acquire knowledge. Now, once again, God is not limited by the laws of nature, since God makes those laws. God, according to Swinburne, is omnipotent in the sense that, quote, he can do anything. God is omniscient, meaning God knows everything. And Swinburne goes on to say on page 8, all God's beliefs are true, and God believes everything that is true. Now that's two claims. All of God's beliefs are true. God has no false beliefs. You and I almost certainly have false beliefs. We may not know which of our beliefs are false, and if and when we discover that we have a false belief, we'll take steps to get rid of it, stop believing it. But God, being God, doesn't believe anything that's false. Anything God believes is a truth. Secondly, God believes everything that is true. There's no truth about the world that escapes God's notice. Now that's a remarkable capacity, isn't it? Wouldn't it be nice to know all the truths and only the truths? So God is a very impressive being, if there is such a being. All right, so we might say, as you can read in my notes, if a proposition X is true, then God believes it. If it's false, then God doesn't believe it. God believes all and only truths. And that's very different from us. You and I don't believe all truths, and we don't believe only truths. I'm sure we each believe at least one false proposition. Next, God is supposed to be perfectly free. Unlike humans, we have limited free will, but God has free will to an infinite degree. God has perfect free will. God's desires never exert any causal influence on God. Now, you and I aren't like that. You and I sometimes have these conflicts. We know what the right act is, and we want to do it. We're motivated to do the right thing, and we know what it is, but we find it difficult. We're torn. On the one hand, we want to do the right thing, but on the other hand, it will come at some cost. It will take time or cost money, or it will be difficult. It will be onerous. So we may succumb to the temptation not to do the very thing we believe to be morally obligatory. Right? That's called weakness of the will. You and I have weak wills to some degree. God has no weakness in the will. God's will is as strong as can be. God's will is perfect. So God isn't even tempted to perform bad actions or evil actions. You and I are constantly tempted. And sometimes we resist the temptation, sometimes we don't. God, not being even tempted, has no occasion to resist it. Right? So God is a perfect being in that sense. Perfect free will, Swinburne calls it. Okay, next. When we discussed Mackey's essay, we discussed whether there are any limits on what God can do. And Swinburne says that God cannot do certain things, such as things that are logically impossible. Swinburne says God cannot make 2 plus 2 equal 5. That would be a violation of the laws of mathematics and maybe ultimately a violation of the laws of logic. God cannot make bachelors married. Right? That's a contradiction. The concept of a bachelor has built into it unmarriedness. So the term married bachelor is incoherent. It's like round square. Right? God can't make squares round. God can't make bachelors married. So God is limited, like you and I are, by the laws of logic. God did not create the laws of logic. God is bound by them. You and I are bound by them. Also, Swinburne points out that God can't know things that can't be known. There may be things that cannot be known. If there are, even God can't know them. Now, these are not real limitations on God's power or knowledge. Even atheists like Mackey concede that. Mackey somewhere says, I'm not going to hold it against the theist or theism that there are certain things God can't do, like make a round square, and that there are certain things God can't know. What would be an example of something God can't know? On page 9, Swinburne says, God cannot know what free agents will do. Think about that. I may not know what some other human being will do later today. Even God doesn't know that. Why? Because human beings are free. And a human being, up until the moment of action, is free to perform or not perform that action. Humans have freedom of choice and freedom of will, and therefore freedom of conduct. And since these beings are free, even God can't know what free beings will choose and do. God has to wait and see, just like you and I do. I may predict what someone will do, and my prediction may be well-founded. It's based on past experience. I may have noticed that Immanuel Kant takes a walk at 1 o'clock every afternoon. In fact, I've never known of a day when Kant didn't take his 1 o'clock walk. I would therefore be entirely well-founded in my belief that Kant will walk at 1 o'clock today. And that belief is based on ample experience. But Kant has free will. And there may come a day, it may be today, when Kant decides for some reason not to take his 1 o'clock walk, even though he's taken one every other day up until now. So not only can you and I not know that Kant will walk at 1 o'clock, God can't either. And that's because you can't know what free beings will choose to do. I should point out to you that according to Kant and his biographers, there was one day when he didn't take his walk. One. The story is that he received in the mail the latest book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he started reading it before his daily walk, and he got so absorbed in it that he skipped his walk for that day. So you can blame Rousseau for Kant breaking his routine. Now, I'm a lot like Kant. Yesterday was my 99th bike ride in 100 days. 99 days out of 100, I rode at least 21 miles. And I plan to ride today, too. So today will be my 100th ride in the past 101 days. So I had an exception to my rule. You may wonder what caused me not to ride that day. Well, I had dental surgery. I had a molar pulled, and I'm about to have an implant in a couple of months, so they had to put in a bone graft, and I was under laughing gas and some pain. And not only that, but when I walked out of the dentist's office, it was pouring rain. So I decided, okay, this is as good a day as any to take a day off from riding. But I plan to keep going. Only the rain or sickness will stop me. Or maybe I'll get Rousseau's new book in the mail and, like Kant, get absorbed in it. Okay, enough silliness. Where were we in my notes? Swinburne says on page 9 that he departs from the normal monotheistic view that God knows what free agents will do. He says his view is implied by certain biblical passages. So Swinburne acknowledges up front that not everybody agrees with him when he says God cannot know in advance what free beings will do. Some people think that God has that sort of knowledge. Okay, so we have a disagreement between Swinburne and other smart people. Swinburne cites the following in support of his view. He says, I can point to certain biblical passages where God is shown to be incapable of knowing what someone will choose to do, some free being will choose to do. So I'm not going to say anything more about that, but Swinburne's view is that, and maybe I could test you on an exam with this, true or false? Swinburne believes that there are some things that even God cannot know. True or false? Answer, true. Right? One of the things God can't know, and there may be others, is what free beings will do in the future. Okay, moving on. God, according to Swinburne, is eternal. That's a word we haven't talked much about, if at all. The word eternal is subject to two different interpretations. Some people interpret eternity as everlastingness, which means existing at all points of time, past, present, and future. So maybe when it is said that God is eternal, what is meant is God exists now, has always existed before now, and will always exist after now. God exists in time at all points in time. That's the first interpretation. The second one is that God is timeless. And that means that God is outside of time altogether. So think of time as in linear terms, as a line. Here's the past, here's the present, here's the future. Okay? The everlasting view says God exists at all points on that line. All of them. The Other interpretation, which says that God is timeless, means that God is outside of time. God is not on that line anywhere. God is outside of it and has the capacity to observe all of the points at once. Now, Swinburne confesses that he finds this hard to understand. He says on page 10, or roughly on page 10, he says, I can't make any sense of this. The idea that God doesn't exist in time like you and I do, he says, I can't make sense of that. So Swinburne thinks it's best to interpret God's eternity as God's everlastingness. God, he wants to say, exists at all moments of time. Okay? And we'll come back to that and discuss that at various points in the book. Okay, another property God has. God is bodiless. I mentioned that earlier. The word for that is incorporeal. A corporeal being is an embodied being. So you and I are embodied. We have bodies. You and I are corporeal. God is disembodied. God is incorporeal, according to the classic view of God. Notice the word corporeal is related to the word corpse, corpulent, corporation. A corporation is a legal body. So Microsoft is a legally recognizable body. It exists in the law as a person, not a natural person like you and me, a legal person. Right? Microsoft is a legal person, and as such, it has rights and duties under the law. Microsoft, the corporation, can enter into contracts with other individuals or corporations. Microsoft can own property, such as patents and copyrights. Microsoft can be sued for wronging people. Microsoft can be prosecuted for criminal wrongdoing. So, corporations are legal bodies consisting of various natural persons, the president, the CEO, the chief financial officer, the shareholders, the board of directors. All of those roles combine to make the corporation what it is. And the law recognizes it as a person. Okay. So, God is supposedly incorporeal, but also, interestingly, omnipresent. So God has no body, and yet God somehow exists everywhere. Not in a spatial sense, not spatially. God does not exist in space and time, but God is still somehow everywhere at every moment. Here's how Swinburne puts it on page 11. He, referring to God, can make a difference to things everywhere and know what is happening everywhere, just like that, without needing arms or sense organs or the normal operation of light rays in order to do so, unquote. And also, that same page, Swinburne says, quote, all of him is present everywhere. So, it's hard to wrap your mind around this, but supposedly, God has no body, and as such, God does not exist in a spatial way, but somehow, in spite of that, all of God is present everywhere. And by the word for that is omnipresent, present at all places, at all times. So God is in you and in me. God is in every inch of the universe. God is in every object, every rock, every stone. If we take that literally, this notion of omnipresence, God is everywhere at all times, but not in a spatial way. Okay, God is the creator and sustainer of the universe and everything in it, including, of course, humans. The universe may have existed forever, or it may have come into existence at a particular time. Swinburne talks about the Big Bang. if there was such an event, that may be the point at which God created the universe. Swinburne says on page 11 that, quote, the theist as such is not committed to one or other of these positions. So Swinburne is saying that you can be a theist and believe either way. You can believe that the universe has existed forever, or you can believe consistently that God created the universe at a particular time, presumably for a particular reason. Okay, I'm going to go, we've gone an hour and 10 minutes. I don't want to go more than an hour and 15 for the simple reason that that's how long we would have in the classroom. So let me go a little bit onto page 4 of my lecture notes. It looks like we're not going to cover all of it, and that's because there's so much packed into chapter 1. But that's fine. We have 2 days next week, and I'm going to get caught up maybe a little bit Tuesday, and then the rest of it on Thursday. I think one way or another, by Thursday next week, I will have caught up and we'll be through chapter 3. So that means for my lecture that I will post on Monday, you should read through chapter 2, because that's the most I'll cover on Tuesday or on Monday. Okay, a couple more things. Let's get started on my page 4, and then we'll have less to do next week. According to Swinburne, God is responsible not only for the existence of objects, including plants, animals, and that term animals, of course, includes humans, but also for their, quote, having the powers and liabilities they do. So you and I have various powers, basic powers, and liabilities. That means you and I are vulnerable to certain things happening to us. We're liable to becoming sick or getting injured or to dying, to being killed. So the powers and liabilities of everything in the universe are given to those objects by God. God is responsible for all of those powers and liabilities. Swinburne says on page 12 that while God is, quote, responsible for the existence of humans, unquote, God does not cause us to form the purposes we do. That is up to us. So God has given me the capacity to have certain purposes. They could be evil purposes or benevolent purposes. God has given me the capacity to freely to choose this or that action, and I'm responsible for my choices. God has given us free will and the accompanying responsibility for the choices and actions, the choices we make and the actions we perform. It's an awesome responsibility. We humans have the capacity to do great evil, to do great harm to our planet, to whole species of animals or plants. We have the capacity to engage in genocides, to go to war with the inevitable destruction of war. So humans have this awesome thing called free will, free choice. God gave that to us, and presumably God being omniscient, knew that we would from time to time, or at least had the power from time to time, to do great evil. So you may wonder, why did God give us free will, knowing that we would, and probably would, do great evil? And of course, you know the answer to that. There must be some greater good. Free will must be such a great good from God's point of view that it outweighs the evil that we do sometimes in the exercise of our free will. The idea is that the only way for God to prevent us from doing evil was to take away our free will, to create us as robots or automatons. And the idea is that those are not particularly valuable beings, right? Where's the value in human beings mindlessly? I'm going to do my little robot imitation. Sorry. Where's the moral value in us robotically choosing the good and never choosing the bad? So God created us not like that, because that's valueless, but with free will. And that's such a great good that God was willing to risk God's creation, human beings, abusing their free will. So that's the story. You know that from our discussion of Mackey's essay. It's called the free will defense of the existence of evil. Okay, so Swinburne says, God does not cause us to form the purposes we do. That's up to us. Well, let's stop there. It's an hour. We're an hour and 15 minutes in exactly. And I'll pick up. Let me put a note here in my notes to remind me of where to pick up. So when I record my next lecture for you on Monday and post it later Monday, I will pick up right there in my notes. And as soon as we're down to the bottom of page 4 of my notes, I'll get started on chapter 2. And we'll try to get all the way through chapter 2 in that lecture. If we don't, if we're still short, we'll try to catch up on Wednesday's lecture. So once again, Monday I will produce a lecture for you online and post it. Tuesday I will come to the classroom, and for those of you who show up, I will have posted some discussion questions. I hope they're interesting and provocative, and I hope you will come to class and join in. I've had fun so far, and if you choose not to, that's fine as well. You can rely on my lectures posted online. Wednesday I will post another lecture for you, and Thursday I'll come to class again for discussion. So that'll be our routine from now on. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So have a great day. And what's today? Today's Friday. Have a great weekend. Root for the Cowboys. I think they play on Sunday. I'd say root for the Rangers, but alas, their season is almost over and they're in last place. Boy, how things have changed in 10 years. 10 years ago, my wife and I had a 20-game ticket package. We went to 20 regular season games, and because we had that package, we were able to purchase postseason tickets. And the Rangers went to the World Series. It was very exciting. The ballpark was full. It was loud. And unfortunately, the Rangers lost that World Series in the 7th game to the St. Louis Cardinals. And it still breaks my heart. The Rangers were one strike away from winning the World Series. One strike. And not only that, there were 2 occasions when they were one strike away from winning the World Series. And somehow they lost that game, and the next day they lost again, and they lost the World Series. I can barely think of anything more heartbreaking, at least in the world of sports. So, what goes up must come down. I assume at some point the Rangers will rise, and I hope it's not 10 more years before they get back to the World Series, but look how long it took the Cubs and the Red Sox to get back to the World Series. Something like 80 years for the Red Sox. So anyway, enough about that. Have a great weekend. I'll see you on the video screen and some of you in the classroom next week.